Hi, I'm Lucinda Curran. I'm from Eco Health Solutions, but also a lecturer at the Australian College of Environmental Studies. Today I'm going to be sharing information with you about electromagnetic field shielding. So what we're going to cover today is what is shielding, what are the limitations of shielding, when should shielding not be considered, when should shielding be considered, materials and applications, and putting things into action. So we'll start at the beginning with what is shielding. So I'm going to start by sharing this story, which is the reason that I got into shielding in particular. So I was just towards the end of my course, I was doing the electrobiology subject and was hiring the college meters from Nicole so that I could go off and do my audit to do my report. I went to meet her at a house where she was conducting an audit because it was nearby to home to pick up the meters from her, and it was this particular house that is why I do shielding. So what happened was on that day, Nicole had assessed the home and there was a smart meter over here. What she advised the client to do was to get some shielding installed. What ended up happening was the person who did the shielding did what I term improper shielding. So they shielded just this room, they shielded around the outside of some of the house, they put some curtains on some of the windows, and that was about it. The problem was that there are so many gaps there that what's happened is that the radio frequencies from the phone towers, etc., could get through the shielding and then get stuck inside the house. What happened for these people was that their symptoms got worse and worse and worse. They got to the point that they basically ended up having all of their power turned off all of the time except for the fridge. And this was right through winter, right through summer, so no heating, no cooling, no lighting, nothing, because they became so sensitive. And seeing this happen and knowing that there were problems in, I guess, the way that the shielding plan was put together was what motivated me to get into this, because seeing this, it made me realise you can get shielding very, very wrong for people and make people very sick, or you can understand it properly and get it right for people and make a big difference. So this is why I learned to do it properly. It's so important to me. So shielding is basically a method of altering the behaviour of electromagnetic fields. It can be used on electromagnetic fields that are easily influenced, and that's been covered mostly in the course already. I want to talk to you now about where it sits in the hierarchy of control. So in the hierarchy of control, we've got these elements. We've got eliminate, which is getting rid of something, substituting, which is swapping it, engineering, which is putting something in place, administering, which is largely education and change in behaviour, and PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So where does shielding fit and sit within this hierarchy of control? I would say that it sits in these two areas: engineering, because we're putting something in place, and sometimes, in some instances, it would be classified as PPE because it's something that's actually being used as a personal protective piece of equipment in some way. So in terms of engineering, this is putting something in place to stop the EMF from entering the property. It could be putting something in place to stop the field from reaching an area. And some examples are curtains, window film, metal mesh, paint on a wall, a bed canopy, and a floor mat. And they're just some examples. There's lots more and lots of different ways to use these materials, but there's just some ideas to get you thinking. In terms of PPE, this is where we put something in place to protect a person directly, and an example of that would be clothing. So shielding is not a device, it's not a pendant, it's not a plug-in. These I'm going to call protective equipment. It's my most politically correct term for that. And I believe that these devices and things basically provide a false sense of security. So if you've got, say, a sticker on your mobile phone that is meant to protect you from all the radiation from the phone, you may end up using it more, and most people tend to do that. So when we know that there's no measurable difference that's achieved by it, what ends up happening is people think that they're safe, they use their device more, and they're actually exposed far more than they should be or they would have been without it. So as I say, there's no measurable difference. They increase their use as they think they are safe. As I said, shielding is not a device, pendant or plug-in, and here are some examples of the types of things that I'm talking about when I'm talking about these products. So the examples of the plug-in devices, you might have seen there's little green plastic things with plugs on them, so you just insert it in a socket. There's little pyramids, salt lamps, stickers for the phone, pendants, jewellery, and things like that. None of these actually reduce the exposure of a person, and they may help, but it's unlikely. And the key here is that there is no measurable difference in exposure. And number one, with anything protective in terms of EMF, in terms of shielding, is that it must reduce the exposure. So with regards to electromagnetic fields, it's always important to work through the hierarchy of control. Can we eliminate the source? Can we substitute it? And if we can't do either of those, can we engineer? And this is where shielding will come in. We also need to administer, we need to change people's behaviour, educate people about what having shielding in place means, and we may need to look at PPE, particularly when they're leaving the home or leaving the place that we assessed. So we want to eliminate that source. We want to get rid of the smartwatch. We want to substitute it for something safer. So an Ethernet-only modem is a great example of that. We want to engineer, so we might install shielding curtains. Administering would be turning the router on only when you need it. PPE, so for example, clothing to protect you when you're out and about. Moving on to the next section now, which are what are the limitations of shielding. I think it's really important to understand that there are a lot of limitations with shielding, and unless you're really feeling confident and competent with what you're doing with it, it's best to avoid doing it. So getting it wrong means that you can make things significantly worse for a person. As I shared with that example right at the beginning, you can make people become more and more sensitive because if shielding is done improperly, you can trap EMF inside a space, and then that will actually increase their exposure. Another thing that it can do when it's done improperly is to, particularly with regards to electric fields, is because it's attracting electric fields to it, depending on where it's placed, it may actually increase the exposure to electric fields, which is not what we want to do, because as I said before, what we're wanting to do is to reduce the exposure. That's number one. To be able to do shielding properly, you need to understand EMF and shielding properly for this reason. So you only shield what you measure, and that you can go back and check. So if it's not an area of EMF that you do measure, then don't try to address that, because you won't be able to assess whether it's effective or not. And also you need to be able to go back to the place to check that what you've recommended is working for the person. So please always bear that in mind. Only shield what you can measure, and only shield what you can go back and check that's working properly. So let's look at the different types of EMF. So we'll start with the extremely low frequency AC magnetic fields. The basic rule is that it cannot be shielded. In reality, there are products that are designed for doing this. However, I don't recommend them because, number one, they're very costly. There are inconsistent results with what happens once they're in place, and they may actually make things worse. So distance is the key with magnetic fields. Distance is free, it's cheap, it's easy to do. That is what we recommend when it comes to magnetic fields. So with ELF, so extremely low frequency AC electric fields, they're very easily influenced, which means we can shield them. Also, the shielding has to be grounded, because the shielding works in a different way here. So what it does is it attracts the electric fields to it. And so we need to ground that material of whatever sort it is to get rid of those electric fields. So it always has to be grounded. And also you need to consider other sources. Where are other sources of electric fields? Because that will impact where you position it. It's difficult to measure electric fields, and if you or the meter are close to the field, then you've changed, and what you're measuring is something quite different. So as I said earlier, if you're not measuring electric fields, please don't try to shield it or don't use anything that addresses it, because you may make it worse. So high frequency power flux density is another type of EMF. I'll abbreviate it to high frequency EMF. It's simpler and easier to say. It can be easily influenced, and therefore it can be shielded effectively. You must consider other sources of high frequency EMF and the behaviour of the occupants when you're putting together a shielding plan for people. The reason you need to think about all of that is because the shielding for high frequency EMF doesn't attract it to it, it actually bounces it off again. So if there are other sources, you need to know where they are and what they are and how that's going to be managed, because again, if you're bouncing it off, you could make things worse. And again, like that example I gave you right at the beginning, that was a huge part of the problem. It's also important to make things very clear for the occupants, as it will involve a change of behaviour. So this is the administer part of it. You need to make them understand that they need to change their use of equipment, their behaviours, where they use things, etc. It's very, very important. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the limitations of shielding in terms of earthing mats and similar products. So I see these as extremely well marketed products. They show lots of fabulous videos that you can watch on the internet that show a drop in body voltage. However, the way they show that isn't the correct way to measure body voltage. And yes, it is dropping the body voltage the way they're using it, but it's not reducing their exposure to electric fields in total. What happens with using these products in the way that they're recommended, so you might be sitting at your desk with a mat underneath your feet or leaning on it, or you might have an earthing sheet on your bed, for instance. With the positioning of these things, what happens is you're directly on top of it, and that earthing product is actually attracting the electric fields to it. And in most instances, what happens is it increases the exposure of the person to the electric fields. So in my mind, these are just well-marketed product and something to be avoided, and certainly not used in the way that they recommend using them. I wanted to share an example that I saw when I was on site in somebody's place. So it was someone who was very electrically sensitive, and they'd set up a canopy for their bed. They used a fabulous material that deflected the radio frequencies brilliantly, but the problem with this fabric was it also shielded electric fields. So it was attracting the electric fields to it. Now, they didn't understand that this was what was happening, and so they just hung it in place over their bed and found that while they were actually sleeping in that bed, they felt a lot worse. And what was happening was, inside their bed area, so within the canopy, there were pretty much no radio frequencies getting through because the fabric was doing a great job. But the electric fields were significantly higher because the fabric hadn't been grounded, and simply by attaching a grounding strap to it, plugging that in to discharge all of that, we're able to get the levels right down. So you need to be very clear about what the shielding materials are doing and how to manage those for a person so that we're getting it right for them. Another story I wanted to share is called the mouse story. So this was a house I went to numerous times to check different things and working out different levels of what was going on in the house. And in my first visit to the place, I made a list of recommendations for my client to work through and check everything off before we put any shielding in place. And she did all of those things. She reported that she'd done everything. She wanted to get her shielding curtains up because there was a phone tower nearby, and that was the only remaining source of radio frequencies. So I organised the curtains for her, she hung them, I went back to check what was going on. And what I found was that literally every minute, so I had my little clock, my watch in my hand, and I was watching, and the second hand would go around, and literally every minute on the minute, my meter would spike. And it's like, that's really weird because that fabric's really effective. So what's coming through that curtain? And I went outside and I was looking for sources. I climbed a really high ladder so I was, in line with the window because the window didn't open, so I couldn't lean out of it. And I was checking to find out where it was. I could not find it anywhere. There was nothing coming in from outside. So given that I'd done a really thorough search outside, I went back in and checked inside. Now, I had assumed, and assumption's always a mistake in building biology, I had assumed that she had literally worked through everything I'd put on that list for her. And she had, apart from the mouse. She had a wireless mouse on her desk, which she never turned off the computer, she never turned off anything to do with that computer, and literally every single minute, my meter would overload because the mouse was emitting such a high amount of radio frequencies. I found that switching the mouse off with the little switch underneath it didn't make much of a difference. I actually had to take the batteries out to stop it from emitting altogether. Once we did that, those readings that I was getting were gone. So you have to be very, very careful to check that everything's been done properly because, as I say, it's easy to get things wrong, and if we assume that they've worked through all those recommendations and they haven't, we can end up with problems like that. Another example is a house where they applied shielding paint without having had a consultation from anybody. They recognised that they were electrically sensitive, they went and sourced some shielding paint from somewhere and put the shielding paint up on the wall behind their bed head. What happened for this person was they actually got more and more sensitive and found that they could not use this room at all. I was then called out to actually check what was going on, and the shielding paint had been put on that wall because there was a smart meter on the other side. So a meter on the other side, it wasn't a smart meter. So she actually didn't need shielding paint for it because there was no radio frequencies or high frequency EMF being emitted from it anyway. Distance is going to be a big part of that when there is no smart meter. But what happened was, because she had the bed right up against that wall and the wall was attracting the electric fields to it, she was increasing her exposure to electric fields the whole time that she was in the bed. So moving her bed to another wall was a simple way to do it, to change her situation, and that actually made quite a big difference. So again, understanding what is happening and making sure that people are clear on what is being done, why, and what they need to consider, and that's part of our job. So we're going to move on to the next section now, which is when shielding should not be considered. And I know that's going to sound strange because I think we like to solve everybody's problems, and in some cases shielding is not actually appropriate. So we'll go through some of those examples now. So please don't consider shielding when you don't know what type of EMF is causing the problem. So this is especially important for people who are electrically sensitive, because sometimes it's not the sort of EMF they're thinking it is, and this is usually where I find people buy thousands of dollars worth of equipment because they can't afford to get somebody like us to come out. They'll spend thousands of dollars on equipment, they'll buy stuff online, and it's not actually addressing the type of EMF that they're sensitive to. So we need to understand which type of EMF is a problem for them, and we need to then mitigate it in the correct way for them. So I often get calls from people with electrohypersensitivity who are desperate for help, and you will too. And it's very easy to try to help them, fix the problem, but unless we go on site and unless we measure and we know what's going on, it can be very dangerous and very costly. As we said before, some types of electromagnetic fields cannot be shielded effectively, and that's particularly the magnetic fields. Magnetic fields, we're looking at distance. Distance is the absolute key for that. Electric fields are difficult to measure and difficult to address properly if we're not measuring it properly, so be very careful with that. And radio frequency or high frequency EMF can be dealt with quite effectively, but it often involves a lot of change in behaviour. So when we don't know what type of EMF is causing the problem, it also can be very costly, as I said, with people buying thousands of dollars of things on online websites and things like that. And many consumers do this and make things worse for themselves. Don't consider shielding when you aren't measuring that type of EMF. So if you can't show a measurable difference, then don't recommend it. This applies to the devices that we were talking about earlier, as well as shielding products. If you cannot demonstrate any difference, then don't recommend it. And so if you're not measuring electric fields, then don't recommend a product that will deal with it. So, and you have to be able to check that it has made the necessary difference. So if you've recommended something for someone, you actually have to be able to check that it's made the difference. Part of what I do is I keep some shielding fabrics, of different types of shielding fabrics in my kit with me. So when I go out on site, I'm checking, I'm trying them out and seeing if they make a difference. I'm trying a single layer, trying a double layer, trying different positions, all sorts of things. In some instances, it will make it worse. In many instances, it will help. But you need to check it so that you know. Please don't consider shielding when there are other sources that can't be addressed. This might be external sources, so there may be a house where there's so many phone towers nearby and so many adjoining neighbours with Wi-Fi and things like that going on. If you can't address all of those other external sources, you need to be very careful about shielding and probably not recommend it. If there are internal sources, and this is often the case when there's teenagers who are not going to budge on their device use, and by actually installing shielding, you may make things a lot worse for somebody. And avoid creating a Faraday cage. So many people are asking, can't we just make a Faraday cage? Can't we just make the bedroom safe? Can't we do this room, that room? Well, no, we can't, because actually it's not good long term. If it's, an occasional overnight somewhere, yes, build something that you can sleep in, but if it's all day, every day, it's not a good option. So avoid creating a Faraday cage. The other thing to think about with that is if you've shielded one room in a house, what will end up happening is all the radio frequencies are bouncing off from the other rooms and you're actually increasing the exposure in the other rooms. So you might have one safe room, but then the rest of the house has become more problematic. Please don't consider shielding when there are behaviours that will not change. So this may involve the use of Wi-Fi. This may be to do with using devices in bed. I think a lot of people sleep still with their phones under their pillows, or they sit up watching Netflix or whatever on their tablets or other devices in bed. So if those sorts of things are happening, then we really want to be careful about what we're recommending, and I would suggest not recommending it in these situations. And then also the use of game consoles. So you need to consider all of these things, you need to know where they are, and this is why you can't do shielding unless you've been out on site. And as I said too, teenagers are often a big part of the equation in terms of whether things can be shielded or not. I've worked with many families with teenagers who've it's been like absolute smooth sailing with the changes, they've been brilliant, and other households where the parents are like, we're not even going to go there because I know that they won't change it. So you need to get to know your clients and what's possible before you make recommendations. And then there may even be things to do with spouses. So one spouse is sensitive or keen to make a difference and the other one's not. And if there is that sort of difference in opinion in our household, again, that might be something that can't be changed, or certainly in the short term, and then we need to be very careful about what's recommended. So please don't consider shielding when your client doesn't understand wireless devices includes mobile phones. So when I am doing any shielding to do with high frequency or radio frequency EMF, I will actually provide them with a list, which I feel is quite inclusive, but I seem to always find something new to add to this list that spells out, not to use wireless equipment. That includes game consoles, smartwatches, telephones, cordless phones, mobile phones, all the rest of it. Be very, very specific with your clients, and if they don't understand, then don't recommend it. If your client doesn't understand the required changes, that they are going to need to change their behaviours and they need the whole household to be on board. If they don't have, if they can't sort of guarantee that side of things, then please don't go with shielding. And if the client doesn't understand what to do. So I find with shielding, you need to be incredibly clear. You need to give verbal information, you need to give written information, and it is sometimes lots of diagrams will help as well, and I actually think that's really helpful for people understanding, and then lots of support in actually understanding and implementing. All of that needs to be in place before the shielding is, because if it doesn't make sense to them and they can't comply, then it's not something we can go with. And please don't consider shielding when it isn't your client. So I think this is actually an area that's very fraught with problems. I know for a while I was actually doing shielding for other people's clients, and this is where I discovered a lot of the problems with that. I think unless you have been on site yourself, you've taken the readings, you've checked for the equipment that's there, you know the client, you know what they are capable of understanding, capable of changing, capable of doing, and how compliant they'll be, then it's not advisable for you to do it for somebody else. So the other problems with this include the responsibility. If you've based what you recommend on somebody else's readings, then who's actually responsible if it isn't right or if it isn't working? Is it you? Is it the other person? Where does that lie? I think it's a very messy grey area that we should avoid where possible. Another part of it is the communication. As I said, when you understand your client, you know what they're capable of understanding and how to communicate with them. It can be very different if you have never met the person before and things go very askew. There can be a lot of miscommunication as a result. And also, in terms of reassessment, if you've provided a shielding plan for somebody else, or somebody else's client, who's going to do that reassessment? Are you then responsible, or is that the person who went out before? So there's just some of the reasons I think it's not worth you doing it for somebody else. I also think in many cases we need to look at doing shielding in layers. So we need to address the sources to start with, and then actually looking at what to do, not just going in and going, all right, that's it, it's all done in one go. In many cases, we need to go back and add those layers to fix the problem as we remove the other layers. So we want to make sure that we're doing it safely and properly, so we're not making anybody else sicker than what they were. On to the next section now, which is when should shielding be considered. So we've talked about when it shouldn't be considered, and here now are the times that we should consider using shielding. So do consider shielding when you have identified the primary and secondary sources. So what I mean by that is you've looked at what is going on that's the biggest cause of the problem, and then also the secondary ones, things that are also contributing. So you need to know the direction and the source of the readings that you are getting. So going in and doing an EMF audit where you're looking at radio frequencies and only using an omnidirectional antenna means that you don't have enough information to do shielding. It's as simple as that. You do not have enough information and you cannot shield effectively without this specific information. You must know the direction, you must know the source, and you must know the actual levels that you're getting. You need to work out what else is around. So yes, there may be, say, a phone tower that's the biggest contributor, but are there neighbours that have also got Wi-Fi? Is there some device somewhere in the house, or the Wi-Fi booster hidden under a couch, which I keep finding in people's houses? Things like that. You need to look for those other sources, because if you put shielding in place and you haven't found those, then you're going to be creating bigger problems. By that I mean, if you've got, say, shielding on a wall here, you've got radio frequencies bouncing off it, then you're going to be creating hotspots in the house and actually increasing exposure. You need to bear in mind that sometimes you will do this in stages. As I said just before, we're looking at the layers, so thinking about an onion, getting rid of as much as we can to start with, possibly going back and reassessing and doing things in stages, step by step. So I'll often provide a plan where I've got, stage one, we need to do X, Y, and Z. Once that's in place, I want to reassess and make sure that's brought down the levels enough, and then I'm going to put the next stage in process. So we're actually working through it systematically without wasting money and without making bigger problems for people. So do consider shielding when you have gathered enough information. So when you have got the readings, when you know the distance of the source, when you know what the source is, when you know what the secondary source is, as I said in the last slide, when you know the limitations of compliance. So what are your clients capable of doing? What are they willing to do? Is everybody in the household on board with the changes that you are recommending? You need to know the client's circumstances, whether they rent or whether they own. For a client who owns a property, they're much more likely to invest in more permanent solutions, whereas someone who's renting is not going to want to invest in permanent solutions. And if you can provide them with a removable or movable solution that they can take with them to the next place, then they're probably much more likely to come on board with the recommendations that you're making. And also, a really important piece of information is to know the client's budget, so that you can organise and create a shielding plan for them that fits within their budget but provides them the effective shielding that they need. And you also need to know your client's preferences. And I found it really interesting. For me, one of the simplest and the easiest solutions to do for people is to put metal mesh fly screen on a window, because that will block out the radio frequencies from outside. Again, having dealt with the internal sources, I have had some clients who've absolutely point blank refused because the idea of having metal mesh on fly screens on a window for them feels like they're going to be in a cage, and they are not going to do it. They would rather spend the money on curtains or another solution. So really understanding what people want. Likewise, on the flip side of that, I've had clients who are very eager to not have curtains, absolutely hate curtains, and we need to come up with a different solution. So you need to talk to your clients about what the sorts of things they like are, what might work for them. Do consider shielding when you can isolate the source via shielding without making things worse. And again, this comes back to having things in your kit while you're on site and trying them out. So the other part of that is you need to be willing to go back and check. So if this is somewhere that's too far for you to go back, then perhaps you're not going to recommend shielding for them, or you'll be able to organise something different in that instance, because it is something that we do need to do. But I think a very simple way of avoiding having to go back in many instances is to have those materials in your kit. You try them out, you get an indication of whether you can do it properly. So like in the picture, simply just putting a piece of fabric up against where the source is coming from and seeing if you are actually making a difference on the other side or not. Is it bouncing off from somewhere else and causing higher levels? And then that will help you create a proper plan. Do consider shielding when you can easily address the source. for instance, a smart meter. Now, most people freak out about a smart meter, but in many instances, they're incredibly easy to deal with. They're one of the easiest things to shield because they're quite simple and straightforward. If it's something like just a neighbour's Wi-Fi coming through a particular point in the wall, sometimes that can be incredibly easy. If it's a phone tower or phone towers where you know exactly where they are. So some of these will be complex in some situations and other times they'll be fairly straightforward and easy. Do consider shielding when you have discussed what the occupant needs to change and or be aware of. And there are a lot of things here. So this also needs to be put into writing before any shielding is purchased. You need to be ridiculously clear and overstate it so that people understand it completely. As I say, I talk people through, I give them diagrams, I put it all in writing and I'll explain it again. And it's only then that I'll go ahead and organise it for them because it does involve a lot of changes for them. Be specific. Even if they appear to understand, you can't be thorough enough. So as I say, go over and over and over it, have it in writing and make sure that they understand it. And note that there are too many instances of do-it-yourself jobs or good salespeople getting it wrong and causing suffering. So I've heard many stories over the years whereby people have spent starting at about $1,000 but ending up, I think the highest I've heard is about $130,000 worth of shielding. You know, their whole rest of their life money poured into shielding that's been done poorly and has actually made them sicker. They're then stuck, they've got no savings, they're much sicker, they've got nowhere to live because where they live is now no longer inhabitable. Do consider shielding when you are 100% confident that what you recommend will make a positive difference. On to the next section now, which is materials and applications. So in this section, we're going to be covering some of the different sorts of materials and applications for shielding materials. There are many different ones available, and I'm going to cover off the most commonly used ones here. So we're going to start with shielding paint, which is fantastic and highly recommended for high frequencies or radio frequencies in the near field. And one of the best uses for that is for a smart meter. And that's because you'd be applying it on the wall directly behind it. It's a fantastic product, it's incredibly effective, and it's also a relatively inexpensive option for people in that situation. There are limitations with it because the shielding paint not only deflects the radio frequencies, but it attracts the electric fields to it. So earlier I mentioned the scenario where the client had gone off before they engaged anyone who's trained in the area and bought some shielding paint and shielded behind their bedhead and then actually increased their electric field exposures. This can easily happen because it attracts the electric fields to it as well. So you need to think about where it's being placed and what else you need to consider, and also making sure there's always distance. So if you're using this for a smart meter, you're only dealing with two types of the electromagnetic fields from the smart meter, and distance is still really important because we haven't addressed the magnetic fields. So considerations include applying it and protecting it. Shielding paint can easily become scratched, so you need to apply it to a smooth and consistent surface and then paint over the top of it to make sure that it's protected at all times. A little tiny scratch can make a big difference. So imagine just being inside a blackened room and then scratching a little bit of paint off the glass and that light comes in. It's like that with the radio frequency, so you want to make sure it's fully protected. It needs to be grounded by an electrician, and you need to be very mindful of other wireless equipment. Anything using wireless technology, you need to consider that, and so does a client. And also you need to talk to the clients about their willingness to change their lifestyle. The next application I want to look at here is the window film. So I've just got some little tiny examples here. So there's two different ones. I'll hold them, I'm not sure how well you can see those, but and there's an image up on the screen. So window films are their best use is for high frequency or radio frequency EMF. Obviously they go on windows. One of the things I don't like about them is when they're on a window that normally would be opened, once they're in place, people generally stop opening that window because they don't have any shielding anymore. That in turn, once you've done this course in its entirety, you'll understand will have implications in terms of indoor air quality, in terms of mould and other biotoxins. So we want them still to be opening their windows. So the only time that I'll actually recommend window films is if it's fixed glass. that won't be opened and can't be opened. So it might be the glass panels on a door, on the sides of a door, or a fixed pane window, say in a shop front or something like that. So that'll be the times that I recommend them. People still need to have fresh air, and so you need to be thinking about that as well. So as I said, the considerations are the indoor air quality, and also, like with the paint, other wireless equipment and their willingness to change their lifestyle. This is really good at deflecting the high frequency EMF, and we need to think about those as well. So fabrics, I love fabrics. I'm just going to show you a few examples. There are so many different types, and this is where it gets very fun. I'll just hold that up to you. There's quite a lot of different, a small sample, but quite a lot of different fabrics available. There's some very sheer ones. There's other fabrics that are a lot thicker. This one's actually a stretchy one. It's been knitted. And then this is one that's classically used for curtains as well. It's quite sheer. They're just some of the many examples of the fabrics. Their best uses are for the high frequency EMF as well as electric fields. There's some fabrics that just do high frequencies, there's some fabrics that just do electric fields, and there's some fabrics that do both. So as I said earlier, unless you're measuring electric fields, please don't use anything that deals with electric fields, because you may make a problem worse for people. So just on materials and applications, there's a couple of other ones that I haven't got in the slides because they change a lot, and they're not necessarily ones you're going to be using all the time. There's this fabulous fabric, I call it fabric, they call it fleece, which is actually designed to be used inside a wall. I don't recommend putting anything inside walls because things change, they can get damaged, and you don't know what state they're in. But I think this is great for making things like a room divider or a screen with. It looks beautiful and it's easy to use. It's great for radio frequencies. This is also one of the examples of the shielded wallpaper, which has just been so fantastic for shielding radio frequencies. It's got a metallic side on one side, and this particular one's a greyish look. At the moment, it's not available, but things may change over time. And certainly it is a fabulous product if and when it comes back. So fabrics are fantastic because you can use them in many, many different ways. You might use them as curtains, you could use them as a bed canopy, you could make a screen, like a room divider kind of screen, where you can protect a certain area of a room and move that round as things change or as a person uses the space differently. Some of the limitations are that the fabrics are quite easily damaged. So in this normal looking fabric, there's lots of metal and it's very, very fine. And what can happen with that metal is that it can get damaged. So if you're scrunching it up or it's beating against a windowsill every day, it may actually get damaged, and then the effectiveness of the shielding will be diminished. So it's important to consider that as well. So if you've got the fabric as curtains, you don't want to be pulling the curtains back every day because they can actually damage the actual structure. If it shields or deals with electric fields, in any instance it has to be grounded, and oftentimes by an electrician. I also have got some grounding cables that I've had made up that by an electrician, where we can clip them on and just plug them into a power point and deal with it that way. But it does have to be grounded if it shields electric fields as well. If you're looking at the fabrics that also address the radio frequency or high frequency EMF, then you also, like with the other materials, need to consider people's use of wireless equipment and also their willingness to change their lifestyles. Carbonised polyester is a fabulous one. It's going to be a little bit hard to show you, but I've got a little example here where it's this amazing black stuff. It's great. It's fabulous for electric fields, and it's also very inexpensive. It's a material where you can actually literally just cut off the piece that you need in the size that you need and use it without having to do any sewing or fixing up edges like with the fabrics I showed you where they're fraying. You don't have to worry about that with the carbonised polyester. It is only good for electric fields. It doesn't do anything for the high frequencies, so unless you're measuring the electric fields, this isn't for you, but if you are, then this is a really good product to know about. It can be used in many different ways. It can be used in workstations, so people's desks, in terms of dealing with the electric fields they might be exposed to. It could be very useful where there's people in a multi-level building and there's lighting and wiring from downstairs in the floor of that person, so you can actually deal with it in that way. Again, depending on other sources, you do need to be very careful. There are limitations, as we were saying before, because it attracts electric fields, it can increase a person's exposure. So it varies here, or your use of it will vary here from the earthing mats and those earthing products we talked about, because you understand this and you need to look at where the sources are. It's best to have it between the person and the source. That's probably really key, the most key point with that one. So some considerations with it is that it has to be grounded. Again, I've got some grounding cables where we just clip them on and plug them in. The placement of it in terms of other sources, because if there's a nearby source of electric fields, it will then bend to go to that, because it's a really great way to reach earth. Now, metal mesh, this is just regular metal mesh. I source things from Y-Shield, and the metal mesh that they have is stainless steel. Theirs has all been independently tested so that we know the actual attenuation and what it's actually at, the levels it's able to shield at. But from what I've seen, other metal meshes can be as effective as this. It's also a lot cheaper to buy it locally than it is to actually get it shipped out from Germany. It's fabulous for radio frequencies, high frequency EMF that are far away, so not in the near field, so it's not going to go over a Wi-Fi router or a smart meter, because in the near field it's possible that the frequencies will actually get through. So it needs to be for things that are further away. So it's great on a window where there's, say, a phone tower in the distance, so that there's enough distance so that the power flux density, you've got the combined electric fields and magnetic fields before it hits the mesh, and the wavelengths means it won't get through. So, as I said, one of the best uses is as fly screen on a window, and again, it's doubling up as fly screen and allowing people to open their windows and have fresh air, which is really, really important. Limitations are that it does also attract electric fields to it, so it needs to be grounded by an electrician or with the grounding cable. You need to consider other wireless equipment, as with everything that does radio frequencies, high frequencies, and again, the client's willingness to change their lifestyle. And the last section now is putting it into action. So you need to understand what the source is and where it is, the strength of the signal or the readings that you're getting, the type of EMF that you're actually reading and measuring, and the one that's also a problem for the client, the position of the source, the position of other sources, so that I'm calling those the secondary sources, occupant activity and their willingness to change, ventilation and indoor air quality, and external factors. So outside of the house, things that are outside of the client's control. You need to gather your data. You need to consider absolutely everything, because this is up to you to work it out properly. This is the difference between us and the good salespeople who sell things brilliantly and market things brilliantly, but we've got the understanding and the know-how and the tools and equipment to measure and plan properly for our clients. What I've got here is a snippets over several slides of the EMF shielding tool, which is a tool that I designed to help you gather the information that you would need to put together a shielding plan. So just noting some details at the top of the form about your client, so their name, their email, their phone, obviously so you're not jumbling this up with somebody else's work, whether they're renting or owning, whether they've got a limited budget, and anything else in terms of the client. So really thinking about them and what they need. The steps here are to complete the shielding tool and then create a shielding plan. You discuss with your client and provide a rough guide with regards to costing, and then you can send the shielding plan through and I can help prepare a quote for them. I've also got some points here that you need to make sure you discuss with the clients. So you need to discuss with them their sources of electromagnetic fields, particularly with relation to what you're going to be recommending. So you also need to discuss with them how they use the space. Is it something that they can change? Is there something that you need to consider that you're not visible while you're there on the day, but you need to talk to them about how that's used so you understand and can organise the shielding plan properly for them. You also need to talk to them and be very clear about the required changes to equipment, and make sure that they understand that all of that needs to be put in place before the shielding is, because in the meantime you could be making problems for them. They also need to understand the required changes to behaviours and lifestyle. So getting rid of Wi-Fi and changing to an Ethernet only router can have you in a household where people aren't willing to change over. And so all of these things need to be understood before shielding's purchased, let alone put in place. And in terms of actioning things, this is really key, is that you've made your recommendations, including those changes, in writing to your client before shielding is purchased. They need to understand and be very, very clear. And if you've got it in writing too, you've actually covered yourself and you can refer back to it. People often forget what you say, or they misinterpret things you can refer back to, but this is what I said. And that's very, very important with this. In the next section of the shielding tool, this is about you gathering the data when you're on site. So the rooms that need to be shielded, the rationale. So actually think about why you want to shield this area. What's actually going to be necessary to do and to consider when you're putting this plan together. Also note for your own records the meter or meters that were used to do this assessment. Over time you may change your equipment and you need to be able to replicate what you did. Also, note down any attachments that were used on the meter. So if you added any of the different antenna or other components, then you need to just make note of that again for future reference. You need to note the source of the EMF and the type of EMF, the location of the source, including the distance, and the highest readings from this source. And then you need to look at those other sources, so the secondary ones that we talked about before. So the position of the other sources and the highest readings from those. And then to really have a good think and talk about occupant activity, including the compliance, how willing they are to make the changes to their behaviours and the use of equipment and the use of rooms. It all can be impacted by your shielding. And the last bit is to really sort of think more broadly, and this is thinking outside the square, but very, very important. The indoor air quality considerations. You know, if you put that window film on the only window in the house, or well, there's only going to be one in the house, but you know, if you put it on something that means they're not going to open that window anymore and there's not going to be fresh air coming in, that's going to be a problem if there's no more air exchanges. You need to think about external factors. So consider things like metal fences, metal fly screens, positioning of other sources, even metal roofs, and even if things change over time. I've been to a lot of places where they've installed a metal shed in the meantime, and that's significantly changed things. So think internally and externally. And then anything else, particularly with regards to clients' preferences and your thoughts about it. So this is really a place where you're gathering your data and really bringing your thoughts together so that you can put together your plan. So I just wanted to recap some key points for you. So with shielding, there is no one size fits all. Every single place is different, and we need to actually go out on site and measure and assess everything ourselves, working out the primary sources, the secondary sources, and obviously the compliance issues that we've spoken about. There are lots of different ways to shield and many different materials, and it's up to us to use our expertise as to work out which is the best for that particular person in that particular setting, considering all the other factors, including whether they rent or they own, etc. Shielding can significantly help or hinder, depending on how it's done and how carefully it's been done, as well as compliance. So it's not only up to us to come up with a good plan, but it's all about that communication and the administration. So make sure that you always remember it can make things better and it can make things worse. It is very easy to get shielding wrong, so be very, very, very cautious with what you do and how you do it. Shielding is not something that you're going to master straight away, but you need to understand that there are many options. And by that I mean, you're not going to have watched this and know straight out exactly what to do. It's going to take a lot of work to learn how to do it properly, understand all the different materials, and know why you would recommend one material over another. Also, you need to use the EMF shielding tool to gather the data and then create the plan, or something similar. So if you want to learn more about it, I actually offer an electromagnetic field shielding workshop through EcoHealth Solutions. It's one full day of training. It's a workshop situation, so we go through a lot of information, but also then put things into practice and work through things together. It's, as I said, workshop style, so I'm not going to be lecturing to you. I'll be providing information and we then implement it and we go back and forth like that throughout the day, and there's lots of opportunity for questions and growing and learning together. There's lots of hands-on problem solving, which I think is so important with this, because it's through that experience that you actually learn a lot. It's always going to be limited to a very small group, so that way I can make sure your needs are met and that you're understanding and keeping up. And it's a consolidation and extension of this lecture, so that you're actually building on this, which I see is the basics, and really padding it out so that you can actually go out and implement it in the field and make a difference for your clients. And also we actually go through the shielding tool in a little bit more detail than what we've done here and put it into practice. We start using it. And also I'll provide a shielding plan template for you to use. So it makes it easy to plan out what you need to for the client, including all the different aspects that you need to cover, making sure you've covered off those points and made it really clear. So if you want to look into doing that, then if you just go to ecohealthsolutions.com.au.